serious?
Hi there guys, welcome to the video. Thank you very much for tuning in, and today you are gonna learn how to add a DJI digital setup to a self-built quadcopter such as you see it here. Yeah, so this is the fifth video in this series in which I built a 7-inch quadcopter. I've done a review of this frame. This is the Rotorama Buddy 7-inch frame. There's also a 5-inch version. I've done a video about this stack here. This is a Mamba / diatone stack. Very nice stack. And well, if you're interested in building quadcopters, you should definitely check out my video about this stack. I've done a video about well, the entire setup, actually a roundup of all parts, and in the previous video we added a receiver, a TBS Crossfire receiver. Yeah, showed you how to do that. So again, in this video I'm going to show you how I add this DJI digital setup to this quadcopter. And you might be surprised to see that this is a Vista unit, not an Air unit, the bigger Air unit. I don't care about the recordings of those Air units. They aren't much better than the DVR recordings of your goggle, and half the time those Air units don't even record. Well, half the time. Oftentimes they don't record, so you can't depend on it. To me it's worthless. Yeah, so, and this is lighter, right? So why not use the Vista setup? This is an original with DJI camera, as you can tell, and I've used this set in a previous quadcopter. That's why it already has cables, wires soldered to it. Yeah, so I'm gonna show you how to connect these wires to your flight controller. That's what you want to do, and we'll see how well to set up the firmware or the software on the Vista set, and how to configure your flight controller Betaflight to actually work with this setup. Let's get started. So the first thing you want to do is download a schematic, a diagram of the stack you're using, in my case a diatone / Mamba stack, so that you have specifications or technical drawings, the pinout of your flight controller at least. Again, be sure to download that and keep it somewhere where you can find it later on. By the time you want to work on your quadcopter, it might not be available anymore, those schematics. So yeah, always keep the schematics of your builds. So what you see here is the schematic of my flight controller, a diatone Mamba F722. My flight controller does not have a plug for the DJI system. Yeah, it doesn't matter, I can simply use solder pads and it'll do the same. Right, and I'm gonna be soldering up the wires to the rear of my flight controller, which is the bottom in this diagram here. And I'm only gonna be using 4 strands. I'm not gonna be using the inbuilt receiver of the Vista unit. Most people won't, I suspect. I have that Crossfire receiver, right? So again, I won't be using the S-Bus receiver of the Vista unit. I'll simply use a 9V as my power source, which is at the rear of this flight controller. I'm gonna need ground, obviously, and I'm gonna need 1 UART or COM port, which is conveniently next to the 9V and the ground, and that's TX4 and RX4. So I'm gonna be using COM port 4 for my Vista setup. And later on we'll see what that means in our Betaflight configuration. For now you need to concentrate on the pads you'll need, and again that's the 9V at the bottom, the ground, and the TX and the RX. And keep in mind that I'll be color coding my cables actually. So I'll be having a yellow, well it's an orange in the diagram, but I'll be having a yellow wire and a green wire next to the obvious red and black wires. So here's what that looks like in real life. This is the rear of my flight controller with the solder pads, and this one over here, the one on the furthest left, is our 9V. 5V we won't use obviously, and then we've got ground, and then we've got TX and RX4. So that's our COM port. And here you see the Vista unit again with the 4 strands I mentioned. So power, which will be 9V, ground, and color-coded strands. This one is orange in the diagram and green. So TX and RX, in case you're new to that. The Vista set, this Vista set has a TX pad and an RX pad, and the flight controller and this Vista unit will talk back and forth. The Vista unit will give feedback to the flight controller about its status, voltage for instance. But be sure to know that again this Vista set will be talking to the flight controller, and that's through a TX pad. Transmit, right? This Vista set will transmit data to your flight controller. Now the flight controller will have to receive that, but it can't receive that on a transmit pad obviously. It'll receive that on the RX pad, so RX4 in our case. So where that green strand over here is on the TX transmit pad on your Vista set, it'll go to the RX receive pad on your flight controller. And the other way around as well. The flight controller will tell things to your Vista set as well. Arming status for instance. Other things as well, but at least arming status, the Vista unit will need to know if the quad is armed or not. And so that'll go from the TX pad, TX4 on your flight controller, to the RX pad on your Vista set. So TX to RX, RX to TX, in short. Right, and well, that's everything you really need to know for the solder job. Right, I will again be using these strands and they are color coded, and you don't need to color code things, but you need to at least make sure that TX on your Vista set goes to an RX pad on your flight controller and the other way around. And cheeky day, as you can tell, I now have my wire, that 4-strand wire over here, running from the Vista set. I will be having it run underneath the Vista, like so. And I've got it soldered up to my flight controller. Hopefully you can even see that I've got it soldered to the bottom of my flight controller. This flight controller has the same solder pads that it has at the top, at the bottom, so that's convenient, and this way I can't accidentally damage the solder connection when I move the battery strap around, for instance. There's no real need to have those solder connections at the top of our flight controller. Just like I have my receiver soldered to the bottom of the flight controller over here. And I even have that wire going to the camera from the Vista set running underneath the flight controller, as you can hopefully see. Do check if you're not pinching the wire, of course. But that's the entire setup. And very important, at this moment, at this point in the installation, hook up your antenna. You never want to power up your Vista set or any other kind of video transmitter without the antenna attached. Otherwise you may burn up the electronics in your transmitter, in your video transmitter. So be sure to hook up that antenna right now before we go in any further. And any further in this case will be the firmware, the software on our Vista set. So we're going to hook up the Vista set to the computer via the USB. You will need to power your entire quadcopter, and then we'll power up the DJI app on our computer on Windows. And as I mentioned before, I have already used this Vista in a previous quadcopter, so I won't have to register it. Simple procedure. If you do need to register that, I'll show you. The DJI app will simply ask you if you want to register your unit. Well, obviously you do after that. We'll update the firmware as I'll show you now. Okie dokie, let's fire up the DJI Assistant version 2 apparently. Cheeky day, hello? Yeah. Alright, so it requires us to hook up the Vista unit to the computer via USB. And I'm first gonna power up my quadcopter. You can't see my quadcopter, but you can hear it. And I'm gonna wait until that Vista unit shows us a green LED. It now shows us a red LED. There, it's now green, and I'm gonna hook up the USB. There, the Vista unit has been recognized, and by this time, if this were a new Vista for you, it would ask you to register yours. And okay, back up. No, not now, thank you very much. Okay, let's see, click. Is there an update available? Yeah, there's new firmware available. And yeah, I haven't used this Vista for a while, so there's definitely a new version out. Okay, so this will take a while, the firmware update. And in fact, it'll take longer than you expect, quite long. Yeah, I'm always taken aback by how long this actually takes. During this update procedure, oh, it's now downloading. After this, it'll install. Right there. Transmitting, so it's now transmitting the new firmware to our Vista unit. Yeah, this will take a while, and during this you might want to consider putting a fan to cool your Vista unit onto the Vista, or blow air over it yourself. Okay, so I'm gonna skip or fast forward the video until it's done updating. And there you have it. Firmware update complete. Very, very nice. And then we hit back in the top right corner. And it'll do some checking. And what do you know? We are on the latest firmware on our Vista unit. So at this point you can disconnect the Vista set from your computer. Be careful, the Vista unit will probably be warm. So I'm actually gonna pull the USB cable out of my computer itself. There, and you can also disconnect the battery at this time. Now again, your Vista unit will be warm, so I'm simply gonna have it cool down for 15 minutes before I continue. Alright, I will add that my Vista set wasn't super duper scorching me hot. I had blown air over it while it was updating the firmware. That did help. Or again, maybe a little fan, put a little air stream on your Vista thing. You don't want it to overheat, especially not in the process of updating the firmware. Bricking, I've never had a Vista or an air unit brick. But yeah, I don't like my electronics to get hot. So, with that said, the next thing we're gonna do is set up Betaflight, so on our flight controller. And that's not complicated, so let me show you what you need to do in Betaflight to make this, the communication between the two work. Alrighty guys, we are again in Betaflight configurator, in the Betaflight configurator. Now I have a new, actually a beta, of Betaflight configurator here. Shouldn't make much of a difference. And okay, I'm gonna hook up my quadcopter, the flight controller that is, to the computer. And you don't need to power your quadcopter for these steps here. We're only gonna have a look at the configuration. So the first thing you want to check is if the ports are configured correctly. Remember that we used a UART4, so TX4 and RX4 to connect the Vista unit. And for that you need to check this box here. Configuration MSP on UART4. I already have it on, as you can tell. In fact, when I flashed the firmware onto my flight controller, I looked at the schematics of this flight controller and knew that I would be using UART4 for this. Anyway, you need this box yellowed out right here, UART configuration. And that's the only thing in this screen. So that makes sure that the Vista unit and your flight controller can communicate back and forth. And if you have changed things here, you need to click Save and Reboot at the bottom right. I haven't changed anything, obviously. Alright, then you move to the configuration, and the only thing you need to check here is if telemetry is on. You need telemetry for this. And the last thing this is not mandatory, but the last thing you basically do want to do is have a look at your OSD. And it doesn't really matter what you put on the OSD here, just throw a couple of elements on your screen, maybe a voltage and an amperage and a quadcopter name. And we do this to check whether the OSD is transferred into your video stream. Otherwise you can't check if the communication is live. I hope that makes sense, but again, put a couple of elements on screen in this OSD and then save in the bottom right again. And that way we'll be able to see whether everything is good to go. And that's everything you need to set up in Betaflight right now. So you can disconnect and then we'll get back to the bench. Alright guys, we are on the home stretch. The last thing we need to do is bind that Vista set to your goggle. And for that you need a little paper clip to press a little button on your goggle. And you need a LiPo to power your quadcopter. Now mine are already bound, so I won't be binding, but I'll show you what you need to do. And to do some troubleshooting if things don't work well. So let me see, we'll power up the goggle first so that it can boot up. Then power up your quadcopter. And the LED on the Vista unit will now be red. After a couple of seconds it'll turn green. There. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see that, but it has turned green. Then you do a short press on the bind button over here, just a short press, and that LED will start blinking. And by then you flip your goggle over. Next to the power plug there's a little hole, and in that hole there's a button. You press down on that button with your paper clip, just a short press, click, and that'll be all. That'll have your goggle and quadcopter hook up, bind. So that was pretty easy, and I'm gonna try to take a picture with my GoPro of the inners of my screen. I really don't know what this is gonna do, but from the looks of it you can see that I have a video feed, a working video feed, and I really don't know if you can see that I have in fact an OSD. At the bottom line you can see some voltages and the quadcopter name, hopefully. And yeah, so on my end things work. That's nice. Surprisingly I can actually, from the looks of it, make a video of this. Okay. Cheeky day guys, that's my how-to on getting your DJI digital setup working in a self-built quadcopter. Now one bug fix or one problem you might encounter is that you do not have that OSD in your video feed. I assume you'll have a video feed, as that doesn't really depend on the rest of your quadcopter. But if you don't have that OSD information that I showed you, that we set up previously in Betaflight, then you probably have the TX and RX switched up. So the two wires, the green and the yellow wire in my case, right? So you probably have those switched up. Or you don't have that TX4 in the ports configuration of Betaflight set up well, but well, that's super duper easy. The thing you'll see most in having the OSD not work is that these two wires are switched around. So have a look at that. If you run into any other problems, yeah, hit me up a comment down below. I might be able to help you, or maybe other viewers. don't hesitate to ask. But yeah, so this, well, step 5. And in my next video, I'll actually be flying this here, the Buddy 7 from Rotorama with Mamba stack and RCN Powers motors. Be on the lookout for that. I hope this gave you some good information. Catch you on the next video. Bye.